My name is Lenora Chase. I am 31 years old, and the strangest thing that happened to me on a cold Tuesday night in Seattle was not the rain hammering against my windshield or the nearly empty underground parking garage beneath my office. The thing that left me sitting there frozen, my hands still resting on my keys, was my phone screen lighting up with 41 messages in one night from a place I had left 8 years ago. Bellmere, Ohio. I stared at my phone for a long time, long enough for the windows to fog up with my own breath. 8 years without a single birthday check-in. 8 years without a Christmas card. 8 years of silence, so complete that I had started to think maybe I had already died in the version of me they told people about. And yet that night, my whole family suddenly remembered they still had my number. I opened the first voicemail, then the second, then the third. No one asked whether I was doing well. No one said they had been wrong. No one apologized. It was just the same kind of voice over and over again, the same chilling kind of false urgency. Lenora, call back. It's important. It's a family matter. And in that moment, I understood that the feeling rising in my chest was not sadness. It was disgust. Because my family had never gone looking for someone unless they needed to take something from that person. 8 years earlier, they had erased my name from that house. And that night, they remembered me only because they had finally discovered that the name Lenora Chase still had value. If you have ever known what it feels like to be remembered by family only when they need something from you, stay with me until the end of this story. But for now, let me tell you about the night my life really split open. I still remember the smell of melted butter over mashed potatoes that night. It mixed with the smell of freshly carved turkey, overly sweet cranberry sauce, and the cinnamon from the pumpkin pie sitting on the kitchen counter, creating the kind of atmosphere that outsiders would have called warm. The house in Bellmere was glowing the way it always did on Thanksgiving. My mother's embroidered napkins were folded neatly beside gold-rimmed china plates. My father poured wine slowly, as if every glass being full could make us look like a decent family. Gavin leaned back in his chair, talking about some new opportunity he had just missed, and my mother nodded with that familiar look of generosity, as if his failure were only a short pause on the road to something great. I sat at the end of the table near the kitchen door, my usual seat, the seat of the person most convenient to stand up and clear dishes. I was 23, working 2 jobs, one at a dental reception desk during the day and one at a grocery store at night, quietly saving every $20 bill in an envelope hidden at the bottom of a drawer. I did not talk much about it. In my house, every private plan I made was treated like an act of defiance, while every dream Gavin had was treated like an investment in the future. Silverware kept tapping softly against plates. Conversations about church, the winter parade, and somebody's son who had just bought a car drifted along in that steady way familiar to small-town dinners. I listened, nodded when I needed to, smiled when I had to. I had known that role for a long time, the quiet daughter. Slightly distant, slightly off-key. Not a problem as long as she stayed silent at the right moments. But that night, whether it was exhaustion or just the fact that I had swallowed too much for too many years, I did not stay silent. Right after everyone finished the main course, I stood up and gathered a few plates into my arms. My mother was dabbing lightly at her lips with a napkin. Gavin was laughing as he talked about how he might pivot again. Aunt Marjorie Hale was asking my father about the Sunday church service. Everything was so ordinary that my questions sounded almost small. "Mom," I said, my voice very even, "did Eleanor leave anything for my education?" The sound in the room disappeared so quickly that I could hear someone's fork touch the edge of a plate. My mother did not answer right away. She set down her wine glass first, very carefully. Then she lifted her eyes and looked around the table. Not exactly at me, but at everyone else's reaction, like someone checking whether the audience was ready. Only then did she turn toward me and smile. It was the kind of smile strangers would call gentle, but anyone who had lived in that house long enough would know that it was when she was most dangerous. "Lenora," she said softly, almost fondly, "why would you bring that up right now?" I stayed standing there, the plates heavy in my hands. "Because you told me she had set something aside for me to go back to school." Gavin let out a breath through his nose as if I had just done something rude. My father looked down at his wine. Aunt Marjorie Hale went completely silent. And in that moment, I felt something cold move down my spine. No one was surprised by my question. They were only surprised that I had asked it out loud, right there in front of everyone. My mother tilted her head just slightly, the smile still there, but her eyes had changed. I had seen that look since childhood, in every moment when she wanted to turn something simple into proof that I was the problem. She sighed slowly and heavily, as though she were the one being forced to endure something painful. "There it is," she said, her voice so soft it nearly sounded sad. "Do you all see? This is exactly what happens when Lenora clings to an idea." I stood still holding the stack of plates against my chest. "I'm not clinging to an idea, I'm asking about the money she said she left for me." "She's just asking," Aunt Marjorie Hale said quietly, but the words had barely left her mouth before my mother turned toward her with a look sharp enough to stop the rest of the sentence on her lips. "I know," my mother replied, gentle in a way that felt cold. "But Lenora has a habit of remembering everything in a way that makes her feel mistreated. I've tried not to bring this up on a holiday, but maybe keeping it hidden isn't helping anymore." I felt my grip start slipping on the glazed ceramic. "What are you talking about?" She did not look at me right away. She looked at the others around the table, as if asking them to be patient with a difficult child. "Lenora has been very sensitive for a while. She interprets everything negatively. A normal comment becomes a wound. A financial decision becomes betrayal." "That was not your financial decision to make," I said, my voice lower now, but sharper. "If she left it to me, then it was mine." Gavin gave a half laugh. "Oh my God, you're acting like we embezzled federal funds." I turned toward him. "If you don't know what you're talking about, stay out of it." "Lenora," my father spoke for the first time, his eyes still on the table. "Let your mother finish." The way he said it was what made my heart go cold. Not because he defended my mother loudly, but because he said it as if I were the one disturbing an order that needed to stay intact. My mother blinked, as if pained by the need to continue. "I don't want to embarrass you, but everyone can see it. She is always wound tight. Always convinced someone is taking something that belongs to her." A few relatives began looking at me with something worse than irritation. Pity. The kind of pity people wear when they have already been guided into believing the problem is not the question, but the person brave enough to ask it. "I don't think she means to make a scene," someone said from the far end of the table. "I know she doesn't," my mother answered immediately, her voice catching just enough. "That's why this family has always tried to protect her. There have been periods when Lenora really struggled. I never wanted to say that in front of everyone. But if she keeps doing this—" She left the sentence unfinished, and that silence was more poisonous than any direct accusation. She did not need to say outright that I was unstable. She only needed to open the door and let everyone else walk themselves into that conclusion. I looked from face to face around the table. No one asked what Eleanor had actually said to me. No one asked whether I had a reason to ask the question. Everything had shifted too fast, cruelly fast. In just a few minutes, a question about school money had turned into a moral intervention, where I was the one who needed to be managed and my mother was the one exhausted by loving me too much. I set the stack of plates down on the table harder than I needed to. The sound of ceramic against wood was dry and clean. No one flinched. Maybe because in their eyes, any reaction from me at that point was just one more perfect piece in the story my mother was building. I did not say another word. I turned and went upstairs while my mother called after me in a voice that sounded both weary and compassionate, as if she were graciously giving me space to calm down. Each stair felt like stone under my feet. I went into my room, shut the door, and only then realized that my hands were shaking so badly I could not pull open the dresser drawer on the first try. I knelt in front of the old wooden dresser, pushed a few wool sweaters aside, and reached for the small blue suitcase I kept underneath. And that was when my hand touched a stiff, old envelope hidden deep beneath the fabric. I pulled it out, my heart pounding hard enough to hurt. On the front was a familiar slanted handwriting, so recognizable that my eyes burned instantly. For Lenora, when staying becomes more dangerous than leaving. I sat on the floor with it in my hands for a long time without opening it. The room around me was exactly the same as it always had been, the cream-colored blanket folded at the end of the bed, the warm glow of the desk lamp, the little mirror near the closet door, but something had shifted completely. As if with just a few sentences downstairs, my mother had accidentally knocked loose the final latch that had kept me in that house. I stood up, pulled the old suitcase out from the corner of the closet, and started packing with hands that still would not stop trembling. I did not take much. A few sweaters, 2 pairs of jeans, underwear, a toothbrush, the small notebook where I tracked my shifts and savings. From the bottom drawer, I took the cash envelope I had been hiding for months, $186. I counted it twice, then added some loose bills from my wallet to make it an even 200. It was such a small amount, it almost felt laughable. But that night, it was the only thing in my life that belonged entirely to me. I changed into a heavier coat, picked up Eleanor's envelope again, and slipped it into the outer pocket of my bag where I could touch it anytime I needed to. I still had not opened it. I did not know why. Maybe because I understood that once I read whatever she had left for me, I would never be able to go back to the old version of myself again. When I dragged my suitcase down the stairs, the little wheels clicked dryly against every wooden step. Down in the living room, conversation had started up again, quieter than before, but not at all embarrassed. My mother was telling some story about a couple from church. Gavin was laughing. My father sat exactly where he had before, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, eyes on the television, as if tonight had only been slightly less pleasant than other Thanksgivings. No one stood when they saw me coming down. I walked across the living room with my suitcase in my hand, like I was crossing through a stranger's house. I did not look at anyone for long, because I knew that if I stopped for even a second, I might ask one more question, and that night had already shown me clearly enough that in this house, every question I asked would be turned against me. My hand had just reached the doorknob when my mother spoke. Her voice was not loud, not harsh, almost calm. If you leave like this, don't come back expecting sympathy. I stood still for one beat. I did not turn around. I opened the door and stepped outside. The November air hit my face hard. The street in front of the house shone with water, and a thin mix of rain and snow drifted down under the old yellow streetlights. I pulled the suitcase along the sidewalk, my shoes quickly turning cold and wet. Every step sounded loud in the stillness of Bellmere, as if the whole town were holding its breath to hear me leave. The bus station was not far by car, but it was far enough on foot in that kind of cold that my hands went numb around the suitcase handle. I do not remember when I started crying. I only remember that when I stood under the metal shelter at the station, I touched my cheek and felt wet cold there. The first bus out of town left a little before midnight. After that, I changed buses twice more, then curled up against the window and watched Ohio fall farther and farther behind me, like a house quietly withdrawing from memory. On the way there, I did not call anyone. No one called me either. My phone was so silent that I almost felt grateful for it. But that silence did not last the way I thought it would. Just a few days later, while I was still sleeping on an old couch in the apartment of someone I barely knew, a text came through from an old neighbor in Bellmere. Your mom says you're going through a hard time. We're praying for you. I stared at those words for a long time. Then another message came in, this one from a woman I had known from church. Come home when you're ready. Your family only wants what's best. I did not reply. That was the moment I understood that I had not only left home, I had been rewritten. In Bellmere, my story was probably already being passed from church pews to supermarket checkout lines, from morning coffee conversations to the parking lot after Sunday service. I had had a breakdown. I had run away because I was unstable. My family was heartbroken and praying for me. And the truth, the plain truth that I had simply dared to ask about something that belonged to me, had been buried so quickly it was as if it had never existed. I sat on that couch with a thin blanket over my knees, my phone glowing in my hand, and for the first time, I felt a loss even bigger than losing my family. I had lost the right to tell my own story. I deleted those 2 messages that same night and turned off notifications from unknown numbers altogether. In Bellmere, they had told my story in a way so smooth and convincing it could swallow the truth whole. And in Seattle, the first thing I needed was not a new life. I just needed a place where the voice in my head would not keep getting edited by someone else. During those first months, I slept on the couch of a friend of a friend. It was a gray couch with springs worn down in the center, and every morning I woke up with my back aching like I had spent the night lifting boxes. I folded the blanket as neatly as I could, washed my coffee mug, and headed to the bus stop before sunrise. Seattle rain was not violent like Midwestern storms. It was just steady and quiet, as if the sky could not fully commit to sadness but could not manage joy either. I went to work in shoes that were always a little damp, in a coat that always smelled faintly like rain and office paper. My first job was as an administrative assistant at a small community development organization. The pay was low. The desk was small. Even the title sounded forgettable. I answered phones, entered data, organized files, scheduled meetings, and copied documents. The kind of work no one remembers the name of the person doing, as long as it gets done. But in that place, I began to notice something no one in my family had ever let me see about myself. I was good at spotting what was off. A form missing a tracking column, a spreadsheet with incorrect totals, an approval process repeating 2 useless steps, a stack of files stuck for 3 weeks because no one had categorized them properly in the first place. I noticed disorder almost immediately, maybe because I had grown up inside it for too long. At night, I taught myself Excel through free videos online, taking notes in a cheap notebook from a discount store. I learned how to clean data, how to track progress, how to build systems clear enough that no one had to guess. I bought groceries from the discount shelves late in the day and learned how to stretch every week, every bus fare, every carton of milk. There was no miraculous breakthrough. I just slowly became less fragile because I was no longer living in a house where I had to shrink myself to fit a role someone else had written for me. Vivian Hart saw that before I even knew how to name it. She was the founder of the organization. The kind of woman who made everyone sit a little straighter just by entering a room. One afternoon, she stopped by my desk, picked up the progress tracker I had quietly redesigned, and asked, "Who told you to redo this?" "I did," I said. She looked at me for 1 extra second. "Good, then tomorrow find out for me why 3 projects are all delayed for the exact same reason." That was how Vivian gave people opportunities. No empty praise, no pity, no questions about what I had been through. She just handed me harder work, as if she already believed I could carry it. And it turned out I could. Sabrina Cole showed up in my 2nd year there, after I had finally rented a small room with a window facing the back parking lot. She joined the communications department, hair always tied up, talking fast, laughing easily, but observing faster than she spoke. We became close not because we looked alike on the surface, but because Sabrina recognized my kind of person immediately. The kind who always sits near the exit, always carries cold medicine, Band-Aids, and a backup charger. Always prepares for the possibility that anything good might disappear without warning. One day, while the 2 of us were eating salad out of plastic containers at our desks, she looked at me and asked softly, "Do you always live like you're waiting to be left behind?" I laughed, but I did not answer right away. Because the way she asked it was not intrusive. It was simply recognition. Outside, rain dragged in thin lines across the window. I watched the water running down the glass and said quietly, "Seattle didn't heal me. It just gave me enough silence to hear my own thoughts without my mother's voice already standing inside them." That night was my 29th birthday. There was no cake, no candles. No one knocked on my door after 7 in the evening. Seattle was deep into late fall, the sky already dark. My 1-room apartment lit only by the kitchen light spilling over the wooden floor and the old heater occasionally shuddering like an elderly person turning over in bed. Sabrina sent me a birthday text and promised to make it up to me with a real dinner that weekend. Vivian sent a short email with only 1 sentence. proud of the woman you've become." I read it, thanked them both, then turned my phone face down on the table. Eleanor's envelope had stayed in the drawer of my bedside table all those years. I had carried it through 3 apartments, 2 jobs, and too many exhausted nights to count. I always told myself I had not opened it because I was not ready for another kind of grief. But that night, sitting alone with reheated soup in a room so quiet I could hear the spoon hit the bowl, I understood the real reason was simpler. I was afraid that if Eleanor said I had been right, everything would hurt much more. I opened the drawer, took out the envelope, slid open the little utility knife from the bottom of my pencil box, and cut it open carefully. Inside was a single sheet folded into thirds, old paper with that dry, faint smell time gives things. Her handwriting looked exactly the way I remembered it, slanted, thin, orderly, as if every letter had been placed on the page with the discipline of someone who had lived too long in a house where speaking plainly was not allowed. The letter was shorter than I expected. She wrote that she knew Pamela did not want me to become independent, because a daughter who could stand on her own feet would no longer be easy to control with guilt and obligation. She wrote that Gavin had been favored for a very long time, and that the cost of that favoritism had often come from the parts of life that should have belonged to me. She wrote that she had set aside money for me to go back to school, and that she had tried to arrange it so that it would not pass through my mother's hands. At the end of the letter, she left one name, Mr. Holloway, and beneath it, one line so short it made my hands go cold. "If something isn't right, ask him, not your mother." I sat with the letter for a long time before I made the call. The next morning, I asked to come into work an hour late, stood in the hallway near the office window, and dialed the number from the note. On the other end was the voice of an older man, slow and polite, the kind of person who still says both first and last name when answering the phone. When I told him who I was, he went quiet for a few seconds. "Are you Lenora?" "Yes." "I've wondered for a long time when you were finally going to call." I met him the following weekend in his small office on the 2nd floor of an old building outside Tacoma, where he had moved to do part-time work after semi-retiring. A tied stack of files sat on his desk. He did not waste time. Eleanor had created paperwork separating my money from the rest. After she died, Pamela had found a way to pull it back into the general family process under the excuse of simplifying matters. After that, the money had been used to patch over a pile of debt from one of Gavin's early mistakes. I listened with my mind almost completely blank. Then came the part that truly took the air out of me. "There was an internal family confirmation form," Mr. Holloway said, his voice slowing. "Your mother's signature was not the only one on it." I looked at him. I did not understand at first, and then I understood before he even said it. "Your father signed the authorization section." I had always thought my father was weak, a man too tired to stand up to my mother, a man who stayed quiet because he was afraid, because he was worn down, because that was what he knew. But sitting in that small office that smelled of old paper and stale coffee, I had to face a different truth, one far more precise and far more brutal. He had not just sat there and watched. He had signed it. "Is there any way to get it back?" I asked, though my voice did not sound like mine. Mr. Holloway shook his head slightly. Too much time had passed. Legally, there was almost no path worth taking anymore. I nodded and looked down at the bundle of files on the desk. That money might have been gone. But the truth was not. Once I saw it in ink, in signatures, in dates, I could never again go back to believing my childhood had simply been a sad chain of misunderstandings. It had structure. It had beneficiaries. And it had adults who had worked together to make sure I was the last person to know. I left Mr. Holloway's office with copies of a few papers that were physically thinner than I expected, but heavy enough to drag down my whole shoulder through my bag. Outside, Tacoma was gray and damp. The wind from the waterfront sweeping across the parking lot with the smell of cold water and metal. I sat in my car for almost 10 minutes without starting it. There are truths you can survive when they are still vague. But once they come with signatures, dates, and witness names, they stop being grief. They become documentation. In the months after that, I worked more than usual. Not to forget, I had already learned that work does not erase anything. It simply gives your hands something concrete to do, something to sort through when your mind is full of things that do not yet have names. By my 8th year in Seattle, I had become director of operations. My name started appearing on the organization's website, in conference materials, in industry pieces I would once have thought had nothing to do with me. Vivian said my name in meetings with a certainty I still had not gotten used to hearing when it referred to me. Sabrina joked that I had finally learned how to walk into a room without apologizing for being there. One morning, the communications team sent me a link to a short interview about women in community operations leadership. I looked at my professional headshot on the screen, dark blazer, hair pinned back, expression calm enough to feel almost unfamiliar. I did not feel proud right away. About 2 weeks later, Mr. Holloway called again. "I think there's something else you should know," he said. I hesitated because this one is more complicated. I was standing near the window of an empty meeting room when I answered. Below me, the back parking lot outside the office gleamed wet from the rain. "What is it?" He explained it slowly. Besides the money Eleanor had tried to leave me, there was also a contingent interest tied to a small piece of land behind the old Pierce family farm. For years, no one had paid attention to it because it sat awkwardly, was hard to farm, and had been divided in a legally messy way. But recently, a new development project had moved through the area. Suddenly the land had value. Not enough to make anyone a millionaire, but enough to make people drowning in debt lift their heads with a different kind of look in their eyes. "Your name still sits at a point they can't easily bypass if they want to move quickly without your consent," he said. "My guess is they'll come looking for you." I did not hear from Bellmere that day. Or the next. Everything stayed quiet for a few more weeks. The kind of quiet that tells you somebody somewhere is preparing an opening line meant to sound just warm enough. Then one Tuesday night, after a long day of 3 meetings in a row and a budget report I had already revised 4 times, I went down to the basement garage of my office building, got into the driver's seat, shut the door, and finally looked at my phone. The screen lit up like a punch. 14 missed calls, 19 texts, 8 voicemails. I sat there still, my hand on the key, hearing the parking garage ventilation humming and the rain ticking through a drain pipe somewhere in the distance. Then I opened the first text. "Lenora, it's Mom. We need to talk. This is bigger than old misunderstandings." The second text was from Gavin. "Don't make this into something bigger than it is. This is family business. We need to handle it like adults." The third was from my father. "You should call home. We need to deal with this inside the family before it goes any further." I played the first voicemail. My mother's voice came through, still carrying that same softness and control, as though 8 years had been nothing more than a slightly extended disagreement. "Lenora, call me back. It's important." Gavin's voicemail was more impatient. "Listen, this is bigger than old feelings, okay? Just call and talk." My father left the shortest message of all. "You should come home so we can talk. We need to handle this as a family." I listened to every one of them all the way through. No skipping, no stopping midway. And the more I listened, the more I realized there was nowhere inside me that softened with nostalgia. Nowhere that trembled with hope. There was only a cold, clean feeling that felt almost like clarity. People can change their tone, change their wording, change the level of urgency in their voice. But motive is much harder to hide. The people who had erased me from their lives were now suddenly talking about family, the way people talk about a conference room that needs every signature in place. They were not calling because they felt remorse. They were not calling because they had finally understood what they had done. They were calling because one part of their paperwork had unexpectedly taken on my face. I set the phone in my lap, leaned my head back against the seat, and stared at the gray concrete ceiling of the parking garage. Outside, Seattle rain kept falling in that soft, steady way it had for 8 years. That sound that had become a kind of background pulse in my life, asking nothing from me. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, my family had finally remembered how to pronounce my name again. Not because love had returned, but because their documents had reached a point they could not push through without me. When the people who once tried to erase you suddenly come looking for you again, It is almost never love. It is procedure. I did not call anyone back that night, or the next morning. I went into the office early, like I always did, carried my coffee past the empty rows of desks, opened my laptop, and started reviewing the day's meeting schedule, as if my phone had not turned into a door being pounded on from the other side. I still worked, still fixed the budget forecast, still answered emails. 3 days later, Vivian asked me to stop by her office at the end of the afternoon. She stood by the window, holding a slim folder. The late light in Seattle made the glass behind her look like steel. Vivian handed me the folder. "Ohio sent an official invitation," she said. "Bellmere Renewal Benefit Dinner. They want a speaker on community rebuilding, local leadership, and investing in the future of small towns." I looked down at the front page. Just seeing the name Bellmere was enough to tighten my throat. Vivian continued, her tone completely normal, as if she had not noticed my fingers tightening on the edge of the paper. "They reviewed our organization after your speech in Tacoma. They want someone who understands operations and community from the inside. Honestly, you're the strongest fit." I turned the page. The organizing committee list appeared, neat and formal, full of names from the town I had left behind. And near the top, like a thin, cold blade, Pamela Chase, committee chair. I looked up. Vivian was watching me, not pushing, not prying too deeply. She was just perceptive enough to know when a professional decision was walking straight through a personal wound. "Can I decline?" I asked. "Yes," she said immediately. "If you decline because you don't want to go, I'll respect that. But don't decline just because certain people will be there." I did not answer right away. I took the folder back to my desk, set it next to my keyboard, and stared at the word Bellmere until the letters started to blur. For the rest of the afternoon, I could barely get anything done. My mind kept circling the same possibilities I had spent 8 years avoiding. Walking into another room in Ohio, hearing someone say my name in a voice that knew too much and understood too little. Seeing my mother standing in a crowd with the same intact smile, as if she had never done anything wrong. That night, Sabrina came over with a bag of Thai food and a cheap bottle of white wine. I showed her the invitation. She read it and let out a low whistle. "So the universe is officially out of ideas," she said, then looked at my face more carefully. "What are you gonna do?" "I don't know." "No, you do." Sabrina opened the takeout containers and pushed a hot box of Pad See Ew toward me. "You just don't want to hear your own answer yet." I leaned back in my chair. "I don't want to go back there to prove anything." "Then don't go to prove anything," she shrugged. "Go because it's your job. Go because they don't get to decide where you're allowed to exist anymore." That sentence stayed with me all night, but the thing that finally tipped everything in one direction came the next morning. Marjorie Hale called. I stared at her name on the screen and let it ring twice before I answered. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered, as if the last 8 years had worn down the certainty that once made her so good at sitting quietly through every family dinner. "Lenora," she said, then hesitated. "I'm not even sure I should be calling. But you are." "Yes." A short silence. "Because there are things I should have said a long time ago." I stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the parking lot behind my building and the green trash bins, dark with rain. The apartment was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator running. "I saw your mother open one of Eleanor's letters once," she said. "Not the one for you, a different one." This was before everything blew up. I asked her about it, and she said she was just checking family paperwork. I didn't fully believe her. But I didn't say anything either. I closed my eyes. "And I overheard Pamela talking to Gavin last week," she went on, her voice quicker now because she knew she was past the point of retreat. "They know you're the speaker at the benefit dinner. They're planning to find a way to get you alone before the program starts. Maybe backstage. Maybe through the event staff. Pamela doesn't want you walking onto that stage before the family has had a chance to talk privately." Even now, even after 8 years, my mother still believed she could get to the story first, could put her hands on it before it belonged to me. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. The silence on the other end lasted longer this time. When Marjorie spoke again, her voice no longer dodged. "Because I stayed quiet for too long, and my silence never helped you." I held the phone and watched the rain slide down the glass in long streaks. A strange feeling moved through me then. Not exactly anger, not relief either. More like some door inside me had finally shut all the way, so another one could open, quieter and straighter. After I hung up, I called Vivian. "I'll go to Ohio," I said. She did not ask why, she only replied, "Good. I'll have logistics lock down the schedule and control access." I thanked her and sat down on the edge of my bed in my small apartment. My coat was still draped over the chair from the night before. The invitation sat open on the table at the page with my mother's name on it. Outside, Seattle kept raining, the kind of rain so familiar it no longer felt like weather but like a kind of breathing. 8 years earlier, I had left Bellmere without managing to hold on to my own voice. Other people had taken it, twisted it, retold it in tones that made the whole town believe I was something to be ashamed of, instead of someone worth listening to. And now, for the first time in all those years, I had a chance to walk back into a room where that story had been living without me for far too long. Just to stand where they had once spoken about me and speak in my own voice. I arrived in Bellmere on a cold gray afternoon, the kind of weather that makes everything in a town look coated in a thin layer of memory. The hotel hosting the fundraiser stood right in the center of town, an old red brick building, restored just enough that people could call it revived heritage, without feeling embarrassed. Through the glass front doors, I could already see the warm chandelier light in the ballroom, the white tablecloths, the place cards laid out neatly, and the people who had once known me only through other people's version of me. The event staff brought me in through a side entrance exactly the way Vivian had arranged. I signed in, picked up my speaker badge, adjusted the cuff of my dark blazer, and stood still for a moment in front of the mirror in the small room behind the stage. 8 years earlier, I had left this town with an old suitcase and shaking hands. Tonight, I had come back with my shoulders straight, a carefully prepared speech, and the kind of steadiness that only comes after you get too tired of asking other people's permission to exist. Through a gap in the stage curtain, I saw my mother. Pamela Chase stood in the middle of the room as if the room itself had been designed to flatter her. Dark blue dress, pearls at her throat, a smile tailored for each handshake. She leaned in at exactly the right angle, touched elbows at exactly the right moment, smiled just enough to seem kind and just enough to seem important. Around her stood pastors, local business owners, women from community groups, faces I recognized from the old church, and at a table near the center of the room sat my father and Gavin. My father hunched slightly the way he always had. Gavin leaned back in a suit that looked just a little too expensive for a man who had never learned how to wear anything in a way that truly fit who he was. My mother did not look up at the stage, she still did not know. When the MC stepped onto the stage, the clinking of silverware faded. The small conversations contracted into the rustle of napkins and glasses meeting tabletops. I listened to the introduction about the fund, the future of Bellmere, the responsibility of preserving community. Then his tone shifted, more formal now. "And now, please welcome our keynote speaker, the Director of Operations for Heart Community Initiatives, Lenora Chase." I walked out just as the entire room realized who that name belonged to. My mother froze in the middle of a smile. The hand resting on the back of a chair tightened slightly. My father lifted his head as if he had just heard a familiar word inside a dream. Gavin blinked, his whole body going rigid. And it was that shared stillness, that collective shock, that made my own steps feel steadier. I stood behind the podium, set down my pages, and did not look at them right away. The stage lights cast soft patches of brightness and shadow across the audience below, over the faces of former neighbors, former acquaintances, and well-dressed strangers. I began in a voice that was even and clear, warm enough to make people listen, cold enough that no one could mistake it for an emotional homecoming. I spoke about small towns, about how communities are not kept alive by funding alone, but by trust between the people who live side by side. I spoke about rebuilding not as fixing storefronts or reopening a small loan fund, but as the willingness to look directly at what has been neglected, buried, or treated as too inconvenient to say aloud. I spoke about dignity as a kind of collective asset, more fragile than money and far more expensive. Then halfway through, I lifted my gaze fully. There are communities that do not fall apart because they lack resources, I said. They fall apart because too many people become comfortable living beside a lie. A dense kind of silence filled the room. I did not need to name my mother. I did not need to point to any table. I simply spoke, in language polite enough that no one could dismiss it, about how some people are turned into the problem simply because they dare to ask a question at the wrong moment. About how the easiest way to hide the truth is not always to deny it, but to destroy the credibility of the person trying to touch it. About how no decent community can be built on the habit of making the most vulnerable person pay the price for surface peace. I saw several faces change. A woman in the third row lifted a hand to her chest. An older man near the doors turned and looked toward my family's table. When I finished, applause rose first from the right side and then spread until the whole room was standing. The old ballroom trembled softly under the movement of chairs and hands colliding. I looked down through the crowd of people standing, and there was my mother still seated, spine straight, both hands set stiffly in her lap. Her face wearing that same calm that only appears when someone is trying not to let themselves crack in front of a room full of witnesses. The networking part afterward unfolded in the kind of atmosphere everyone kept trying to call normal, even though no one actually believed it was. People came up to shake my hand, thank me, tell me the speech was memorable. Tell me Bellmere needed to hear things like that. I had just set my water glass down on a cocktail table near the window when my mother appeared. She moved quickly but not hurriedly, her smile already repaired into perfection. "Lenora," she said, her voice syrupy smooth. "Oh my goodness, what a surprise." Then she opened her arms as if the last 8 years had been nothing more than a minor misunderstanding, easy to overlook in front of strangers. I did not step back. But I did not step into that embrace either. I looked at her and said, clearly enough for the people nearby to hear, "You didn't come looking for me because you missed me. You came looking for me because my signature finally has value." The smile on her lips paused for exactly 1 beat. It just stopped there, like glossy paint meeting a crack too real to cover. "Lenora, don't talk like that here," she said under her breath, while keeping her public face perfectly pleasant for the people around us. "Here is exactly the place," I said. Gavin stepped in almost immediately, his face red with the kind of anger that always comes before reason in people who have spent their whole lives being told they deserve everything. "You're acting like we need something huge from you. It's just about the land." He stopped too late. The air around us changed in a single second. The woman holding a glass of red wine beside us lowered her hand slightly. A man from the local business council frowned. My mother snapped her head toward Gavin, her eyes sharp enough to stop the rest of that sentence on the spot. I left the ballroom before the night could turn into the kind of scene everyone would be able to retell the next morning in whatever way was easiest for them. No one stopped me at the door. Maybe because after Gavin's slip, no one knew how to pretend anymore. The parking lot behind the hotel was cold and almost empty. I sat in my car for a long time with both hands on the wheel, looking at the yellow light spilling from the old building in front of me. Inside, my family was probably still struggling under glances, questions, and those polite social silences that hurt more than a shouting match. And I, for the first time in years, did not feel like I had run away. Back in my hotel room in Bellmere, I took off my shoes, opened my laptop, and wrote exactly 1 email to my mother, my father, and Gavin. I wrote slowly, with almost no editing. I told them clearly that I would not sign any document just because they tried to pressure me. I would not pay anyone's debts, I would not transfer money, and I would not reopen a relationship simply because they had suddenly remembered the word family when they needed someone to save them from the consequences of their own decisions. If they truly wanted to start over, I wrote, then it would have to begin with the truth. Not with phrases like "we did our best." Not with "that was a hard time for everyone." With the full truth, clearly named and tied to actions and responsibility. I hit send and closed the laptop. That night I slept less than I needed to, but more deeply than I expected. My father's letter arrived almost 3 weeks later. White envelope. Careful handwriting, tilted slightly to the right, the same way I used to see him write grocery lists on scraps of paper beside the refrigerator when I was little. I opened it at my desk in Seattle in the middle of a rainy afternoon. The letter was not long. For the first time in his life, my father wrote sentences that left him nowhere to hide. He admitted that he had not simply sat by and watched, he had signed. He had chosen his own comfort over protecting his daughter. He wrote that for years he had called that keeping the peace, but now he understood it was only a polite name for cowardice. I read it all the way through, folded it carefully, and put it in my desk drawer. My mother could not do that. She sent a long email full of sentences that sounded like apologies but were really just one more effort to rearrange history into something she could live with. I did what I thought was best. You were difficult to reach. Families make imperfect decisions under pressure. I finished reading it and felt less anger than exhaustion. Gavin was worse. He sent 3 lines saying, basically, that if I had not blown everything out of proportion, the family would not be in this mess. Marjorie called twice, saying she wanted to make things right, wanted to see me, wanted to explain why she had stayed silent for so long. I did not cut her off completely, but I kept my distance. Some people arrive too late to be allowed straight into the healing. Instead of keeping my energy there, I did something else. I called Mr. Holloway back. Then I called the student support office at a community college near Seattle. A few months later, a small scholarship fund named after Eleanor Pierce was established for young students whose families had cut off their financial support or forced them to keep studying without any real safety net behind them. It was not big, not enough to change anyone's life overnight. But it was enough to keep one student from dropping out, because control at home had been disguised as love. One Sunday evening in early summer, Sabrina came over with 2 loaves of bread and a cheap bottle of wine. 2 other co-workers stopped by after that, carrying pasta still warm in paper containers and a cake they had picked up in a hurry from the shop on the corner. We sat around the little dining table by the window, music low in the background, talking about things that were not especially important. A new project, a difficult client, the fact that somebody had burned garlic in a pan the week before. The kitchen light was warm, the wine glasses did not match, neither did the plates, and because of that, it felt beautiful in a way that almost hurt. That table was much smaller than the dining table in Bellmere. There were no embroidered napkins, no gold-rimmed china, no one presiding over the room, but it was the first time in my life I had ever sat down to a meal without measuring how much I should speak, how small I should make myself, how quiet I should stay to keep everyone else comfortable. I looked around at the faces at that table, heard Sabrina laugh at something silly, and understood that I had not gone back to Ohio to beat them. I had gone back so I could stop losing to myself. The family I was born into taught me how to disappear. And the life I built taught me how to stay. Maybe the thing that stays with me most after everything is not who was right and who was wrong. It is not even whether I have fully forgiven anyone in the end. The thing that has stayed with me longest is the very quiet peace of realizing that I no longer have to prove my worth to people who only know how to look at me through a lens they created themselves. There are losses that never fully leave. There are wounds that still ache when the weather turns cold, when an old song comes on, when a certain smell pulls you back to a place you once fought to escape. But there is another truth too. A gentler one. Life can still open up after injury. There can still be a small table, a warm kitchen, a few sincere people, and a version of yourself that no longer has to shrink in order to be loved. I think a lot of us grow up believing family must be preserved at any cost. But over time, I came to understand that what is worth protecting is not the shape of a family, but your dignity inside it. And sometimes, loving yourself enough to leave the place that keeps hurting you is one of the deepest ways to end a cycle that has lasted far too long. I have a question for you, and I want you to answer honestly. If your family called you tomorrow after years of silence, what do you think they would say first? I need help, or I'm sorry. You can also tell me where you're watching from, or whether you have ever lived through the feeling of being misunderstood, minimized, or called by a name that did not match who you really were. I read every single comment, and I am always grateful when stories here help someone feel a little less alone. And if this story touched you, you can subscribe and stay with me for the next ones. Stories about hurt, truth, self-respect, and the people who finally chose to stand on their own side. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next video.